Coming up, is the Commission of Inquiry just a pre-election dog and pony show? And the Dr. Manza saga continues.
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Do you recall that on 3rd November 2020 you approved 10.299 acres in Carmelita to Mr. Zhourong Li?
I do not recall, sir.
Do you recall that on the 27th October 2020 you transferred half acre in San Pedro to Mr. Zhourong Li?
I certainly do not recall, sir.
Do you recall that on the 3rd November 2020 as well, you also transferred 52.7 acres 10-pound key registration section to Mr. Zhourong Li?
I do not recall, sir.
Do you recall that on the 14th August 2020, you transferred 2.04 acres on San Pedro to Mr. Zhourong Li?
I do not recall, sir.
Do you recall that on the same day, 14th August 2020, you also transferred a lot comprising 486.277 square meters on Kikaka to Mr. Zhourong Li?
I do not recall, sir.
What about on the 13th August 2020, another lot, parcel 8673 on San Pedro to Mr. Zhourong Li? Do you remember that?
I do not recall, sir.
Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of March the 1st. Well, one of the big stories from last week, for those of you who can recall, was the continuation of the Commission of Inquiry into the fire sale of public assets that took place in the weeks and days before the November 20th general election. Now, the timing of the inquiry and the summoning of the first few witnesses has no doubt been carefully scheduled in order to put some UDP dirty laundry on public display just in time for the March 3rd municipal elections. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't be demanding this kind of public investigation into what has become business as usual whenever a political party reads the tea leaves and realizes that their time in power is quickly coming to an end. But we should also be demanding that something will actually be done once these Commission of Inquiries present their findings and recommendations. Now, the star witness last Friday morning was Hugo Patt, the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Minister of Natural Resources, and the only member of Team Saldivar who managed to hold on to his seat in the House of Representatives in November's general election. Patt was brought before the Commission not just to justify why a 2020 Toyota Tacoma purchased for nearly $90,000 in February of last year was made available for him to purchase for only $65,000 just 9 months later, but also to explain why he never bought the vehicle and instead facilitated a bizarre chain of custody that involved several parties, a most unorthodox series of loans and repayments, and quite possibly some shenanigans at the Lands Department. You see, Hugo Patt decided that he could not afford the truck, despite it being such a sweetheart of a deal. So instead, he got his friend, Juvencio Herrera, to buy the vehicle with the understanding that Patt would buy it from Herrera later when he could afford to do so. Except Juvencio Herrera didn't have the $65,000 either. So he called on San Pedro businessman Zhourong Li, also known as Kelvin Li, and asked Li to lend him $65,000. Li testified that he knew Herrera from some work that he did renovating Li's warehouse, and that he simply trusted Herrera to pay him back despite not asking for any details of why Herrera needed the money. No credit check, no collateral, no contract. Li claims all he knew was Herrera needed the money to pay GOB. Well, as luck would have it, Kelvin Li had a couple of business associates who owed him exactly $65,000. So he asked car dealer Emil Torres to pay the government of Belize $50,000 on his behalf, and a company called Marina Services to pay the balance of $15,000. So GOB received $50,000 from Emil Torres and $15,000 from Marina Services on behalf of Kelvin Li to pay for a vehicle that was being sold to Juvencio Herrera on behalf of Hugo Patt, who had begged Prime Minister Dean Barrow and Financial Secretary Joseph Waite to make a special exemption just for him on the policy prohibiting the sale of serviceable government vehicles to anyone. So are you confused? Good, because that's exactly what everyone involved in this game of vehicular three-card Monte intended. But that's not the end of the curious case of this government pickup. Now, despite all the maneuvering it took to enable Herrera to be able to buy the Toyota Tacoma on behalf of the temporarily cash-strapped Hugo Patt, Herrera apparently only had possession of the truck long enough to get it licensed and registered. Instead, Herrera left the vehicle with former Deputy Director of Lands Ivan Leyva in Orange Walk, who in turn contacted Belize City car dealer Said Perdomo. Leyva informed Perdomo that Herrera only wanted $66,000 to recover the $65,000 he borrowed, plus another $1,000 for licensing and registration. So Perdomo took the vehicle on consignment on December 2nd and transferred the title into his own name on January 12th, just prior to completing the sale to an unnamed private individual. Perdomo says he sold the vehicle for $80,000 and delivered $66,000 in cash to Ivan Leyva on instructions from Juvencio Herrera. Sometime shortly after this, Juvencio Herrera of Belmopan met up with Kelvin Li of San Pedro at a location on Euphrates Avenue in Belize City, where he handed over $65,000 in cash. Now that's a lot of cash to be walking around with. Someone needs to tell Messrs. Leyva, Herrera, and Li that banks can actually transfer funds for as little as $3 per transaction. So according to the version of events provided during various testimony last Friday, Kelvin Li lent $65,000 to Juvencio Herrera on good faith and received nothing for his kindness. Herrera borrowed $65,000 to buy a vehicle that he almost immediately relinquished possession of, and despite the vehicle being sold for $80,000 a mere 2.5 months later, only wanted to break even. Ivan Leyva, who had physical possession of a vehicle he did not own and served as the intermediary for payment from Said Perdomo to Juvencio Herrera, was simply doing Herrera a favor. The only party who openly admits to benefiting from all of this is Said Perdomo, who appears to have made about $8,000 on the sale of the vehicle, which is a perfectly legitimate commission on the sale of an $80,000 truck. But other than Perdomo, it's hard to believe that so many people went to such great effort for absolutely no reward. Especially for what was supposed to be a special favor granted to Hugo Patt by his former boss. And all these sordid details of the Toyota Tacoma would be enough to unpack on their own, except that it appears there may be a connection to some very questionable transactions at the Lands Department. Yeah, that old hotbed of corruption. The very department that Hugo Patt was made minister of in June of 2018. Once upon a time, Patt had served as Minister of State under previous Minister of Natural Resources Gaspar Vega, until Vega resigned from cabinet in disgrace after a shady land transaction and compensation payment involving his son came to light in October of 2016. Following Vega's resignation, then Prime Minister Dean Barrow took on the portfolio of natural resources, but tasked Dr. Carla Barnett with the day-to-day running of the ministry, with an emphasis on cleaning up corruption in the Lands Department. Well, Dr. Barnett might have done too good of a job, because less than 2 years later, she was shuffled out of natural resources, allegedly due to pressure from certain members of the Barrow cabinet who were unhappy about the disruption to doing business as usual. So in comes Hugo Patt, who learned everything he knew about managing our national patrimony from his old boss, Gaspar Vega. Immediately, Patt pledges that under his stewardship, he would ensure that the system of processing applications at the Lands Department would be streamlined and that land titles would be delivered quickly. And as we learned last Friday, Patt kept his word on that, at least as far as Kelvin Li was concerned. What we learned is that Zhourong Kelvin Li had received multiple parcels of government land in just over a year, including 8 lots in San Pedro, plus an additional half-acre in San Pedro on October 27th, and 10.3 acres of land in Carmelita Village on November 3rd, just 8 days before the general election. And if that wasn't enough, Li also acquired another 12 parcels of government land on the same day that they were sold to third parties, including Wasani and Jafari Castro. Patt told the commission that he had no idea who those gentlemen were, despite being the notorious sons of his fellow cabinet member, Edmund Castro. When pressed by lead commissioner Andrew Marshallek, Patt also denied knowing Zhourong Kelvin Li, and claimed he did not recall signing off on so many land transfer documents for Mr. Li in such a short period of time. In his defense, he said that as minister, he signed so many land documents that it's impossible for him to recall any particular application. That by the time the papers are ready for his signature, he simply assumes that everything has been properly vetted and approved, and that the recipient is a Belizean who deserves a piece of government land. Now, if that flimsy excuse of, I signed so many documents I can't be expected to notice when something is wrong, sounds familiar, it's because we've heard it before. Specifically, on June 13th, 2000, when then Minister of Natural Resources, Johnny Briceño, basically said the same thing when it came to light that he had signed off on the sale of one of the Silk Keys to Gabby Afif for $2,560. Government was able to recover the key, but it ended up costing you and I $1.5 million to do so. And here's the kicker. The key was not even available for sale because it had already been sold to Eugene Zabanet during a previous PUP administration in the 1980s. So there is a long and sordid history in Belize of fast-tracked land applications for favored individuals, selling land that is already privately owned for a pittance and then offering massive compensation when these errors are discovered, and of course, near complete amnesia from all involved every time these scandals are exposed to the public. And that's what pisses me off, because I know nothing substantial will come from this commission of inquiry, just like nothing has come from several immigration inquiries over the last 19 years. Or the DFC Commission of Inquiry that went on for over 2 years from 2005 to 2007. And all we will get is a steady stream of, I do not recall, from witnesses. And then eventually the commission will release its report telling us what we knew was happening long before the inquiry began. And maybe that report will be forwarded to the police, who will certainly not bring criminal charges against anyone. No matter how obvious it was that Zhourong Li was getting special treatment at the Lands Department, and even if the commission can somehow uncover what role Patt's pickup truck played in this whole affair, nothing will be done to make sure that this doesn't happen again. It's only ever Her Majesty's loyal opposition who wants the United Nations Convention Against Corruption implemented. It's only ever the party out of power that howls and wails for loopholes to be closed and for ministers to be stripped of their discretionary powers. It's only ever the party loyalists who are on the wrong team and can't buy a government vehicle for tens of thousands of dollars below market value who have an issue with this type of corruption. Now, the latest commission of inquiry has only just begun, and the current administration is only just past their first 100 days in office. So, maybe in time the Belizean government will prove me wrong. But history suggests otherwise.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's OXA Productions with an S.com.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
Hi, this is Brent. Thanks for calling the Your 2 Cents hotline. Please leave a message about anything you want to talk about after the beep.
Hey, good evening, Brent. So, I read on the news today that the latest development in the Dr. Manzanero saga is that he's been placed on administrative leave effective today, and I find it so disconcerting that it just makes me think of that saying that those who help should have a short memory, but those who receive instead should have a long one. I do not know Dr. Manzanero personally, but by all accounts and what I've seen of him on the television, what I'm sure many Belizeans saw of him, is that through Belize's lowest and highest COVID numbers, he was a person who remained calm, who helped, who gave of his time and energy, and facilitated the government and the country by remaining professional in daunting, unprecedented times. There was no rulebook, and there remains no rulebook on how to manage COVID 100% effectively. I think for many people, not only our doctors here in Belize, but the world over, it's been a steep learning curve. So for me, the actions of our new government, compounded by the fact that it's on the heels of Dr. Manzanero's own battle with COVID, it seems like ingratitude and a direct slap in the face. I hope at the end of the day it is not about ego, and I really hope it's not true, because something like this can have damning consequences for Dr. Manzanero's career.
Hey, I want to thank everyone who shared last week's podcast about how Dr. Manzanero is getting the bum's rush from the Ministry of Health and Wellness. That episode was downloaded more times in the first 7 days than any episode of Brent's 2 Cents in the last 6 months. And that was without any kind of paid promotion. The audience was nearly double what this podcast normally gets in the first week of release. And that's because of all of you who feel this show has value and might be of interest to someone else. So again, thank you so much for your support. Now, I really didn't think there would be a need for a part 2 about Dr. Manza this week, but the saga has had a few interesting developments. The week started with the shocking announcement that Dr. Manzanero had been placed on administrative leave and was being investigated for misconduct. In particular, that a decision he made last April to not accept an offer from the Belize Agriculture Health Authority to use their lab to assist with processing test results somehow contributed to the number of COVID-19 deaths. Now, last week I said that the Minister of Health and Wellness, Michelle Shabat, was determined to get rid of Dr. Manzanero, even if it resulted in a lawsuit. But I didn't think anyone would sink so low as to try and assassinate the man's professional reputation. Let me take you back to the spring of 2020. On April 13th, Belize had recorded 18 cases of coronavirus and 2 deaths. By May 5th, the remaining 16 cases had recovered, and Belize was statistically COVID-free and would remain that way for another month, until a repatriated Belizean returning on a cruise ship tested positive. Then, a border jumper tested positive in the first week of June. A few weeks later, a Belizean arriving on a repatriation flight brought the grand total of COVID-19 infections recorded in Belize to 23. That's only 5 new cases between April 13th and June 19th. The Ministry of Health was only running tests 3 days per week because that's all that was required back then. There was no backlog. In fact, Belize was in such good shape that many of the restrictions were greatly relaxed on June 1st. And by July 1st, everything was pretty much back to normal, other than the land borders and the airport remaining closed. Even bars and nightclubs were back in business. And business for those type of establishments was booming. Yet the Ministry of Health and Wellness wants to allege that somehow the hundreds of people who would die in the last months of 2020 after the massive spike in infections that was no doubt caused by campaigning during the general election and the victory parties that followed is somehow the responsibility of a decision Dr. Marvin Manzanero made 6 months earlier. No, that's bullshit. Complete and utter bullshit. Well, it appears the overreach by some of Manzanero's detractors has gone so far that even the acting director of health services, Dr. Melissa Diaz-Musa, wants no part of this kangaroo court. Dr. Diaz-Musa has vacated the DHS office and has instead returned to her previous post as Deputy Regional Manager of the Central Health Region. So, in less than a week, Belize went from having 2 directors of health services to having none. Now, I think Manzanero's 5-day administrative leave will end on Tuesday, March the 2nd. But based on the tone of Minister Shabat's comments to Channel 5 last Friday night, it certainly sounds like the minister is digging in and insisting that proper procedure to move Manzanero out has been followed. He went on to say that 2 people in particular, who I assume are Sharon Fraser, the president of the Association of Public Service Senior Managers, and Jacqueline Willoughby, past president of the Public Service Union, are spreading misinformation. But even if Mr. Shabat is prepared to get into a pissing contest with everyone who dares to defend Dr. Manzanero, it does appear that mounting public pressure over the mishandling of the DHS debacle is starting to get to the Prime Minister. Johnny Briceño, or as the media have now begun to call him since he became Prime Minister, John Briceño, is actually a really nice guy. Personally, I've always liked him. Politics might be a dirty game, but Johnny has never been much of a mudslinger. And I've never seen him take criticism personally or treat anyone with hostility. Not even that 21-year-old reporter I once worked with who had the audacity back in the year 2000 to surprise Mr. Briceño with her question about why he signed off on selling one of the silk keys for a pittance. So that's why his reaction to this question last week, while on the campaign trail, seemed so out of character.
I find it quite ironic that Ms. Willoughby finally opened her mouth, because when the UDP government was breaking all the laws, including the public service, she kept her mouth shut. So Ms. Willoughby is supposed to shut up right now.
Clearly, the PM owes Ms. Willoughby an apology. And for the sake of decorum, I hope one is forthcoming. But the Dr. Manza situation has become the metaphorical rain on GOB's COVID-19 victory parade. We might be about to enter some sort of remission from infections like what we saw in May and June of last year. But it won't last. A third wave is all but inevitable, especially given how long it's going to take to vaccinate enough Belizeans to reach anything close to herd immunity. And if Team Shabat continues to war with Team Manzanero, the amount of finger pointing and backbiting is going to be exponentially worse when that third wave hits Belize and people once again start dying in large numbers. Okay, before I go, I have a lot of Belizean podcasters that I need to mention. And this makes me so happy to see so many others putting out great Belizean podcasts. In no particular order, Walasaha from Dominique Morales, the Natasha Stewart podcast, and Paul Schmidt, the opinionated Cruffy, all dropped new episodes this week. The Gentle Perspective has a brand new episode coming out on YouTube tonight, Monday, March the 1st. And a big welcome back to Aria Lightfoot, who released the first new episode of Toucan View in nearly a year. I'll put links to all these podcasts in the description for this episode. Remember, you can be part of the podcast movement in Belize by sharing Brent's 2 cents with at least one person who otherwise may not know about it. And don't forget to subscribe to all the great Belizean podcasts on your favorite app so you never miss an episode from any of us. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at 2 Cents Belize. And I would especially love it if you would leave a voice message for the podcast about anything you want to talk about. You will find the link to do that in the description for this episode. And that's going to do it for episode 27 of Brent's 2 Cents. If you're listening to this podcast before Wednesday, March the 3rd, please go out and vote, but do so safely. And for God's sake, no celebrating this time. Okay, I'll be back with a brand new episode on Monday, March the 8th. But until then, please continue to wear your masks. Wash your hands. Stay home as much as possible. And most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 Cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.